Hello, I'm Rob.
Hello, I'm Rob.
Welcome to another Press X. This time, quite a simple concept. Genres which indie games served.
Yeah.
I don't really need to over-explain that, so I'm just going to jump straight in with my pick, which is a survival horror. I don't want to say saved, because it's too early to speak, I think, on that, but we'll get to that. Basically, the problem with survival horror is the AAA studios got hold of it. So we're talking about Dead Space 3, I think it was Resident Evil 6, and games like that. Games where basically they were fundamentally survival horror, but they'd been mainstreamized where they were putting in rude multiplayer for no reason. They made them action games.
Yeah, I was about to say...
And any
Resident
idea
Evil
of them
6.
being survival or horror was dead. They'd been killed.
That's what I mean. Resident Evil 5 and 6, neither of them were traditional Resident Evil games. Both of them were very much action shooters.
And Silent Hill went that way as well, before Konami totally lost interest in it.
Which is a shame, because I think Silent Hill is one of those franchises where they could really do some interesting work.
I don't know whether it was in the game or the demo, but that sequence in which you are basically killed by a bunch of knife-wielding babies is one of my most...
That is actually the demo of Silent Hill that you got
but even
with Metal Gear Solid.
That sequence is possibly the one which stands out to me most in my entire history of playing games, because it's horrible. It's horrible.
But that's the thing. That was the demo of Silent Hill that you got with Metal Gear Solid when you bought Metal Gear Solid, if I remember rightly. And that demo had two modes. You had the exploration mode where you could basically explore around the hospital or the school or whatever it was, and then you had like I suppose you'd call it a horde mode where you just attacked by all these waves of these ghost zombie babies wielding massive knives.
And yeah, so they were killed off basically because they weren't profitable enough. Selling 4 million units isn't profitable enough, so they were basically put in the pile alongside skateboarding games of genres that people aren't interested in.
Yeah, I mean, my main issue with survival horror games, especially indie ones, is that something like Five Nights at Freddy's technically classes as survival horror, indie survival horror.
Well, I was talking about Outlast and stuff like that.
Is Outlast...
I'm not a fan of Outlast, because Outlast is basically dark, quiet, bang, boo.
Yeah.
And it's exhausting because of that. But it did get people playing it on streams. It did get eyes on the genre, which haven't been in it a long time. It did get... I mean, there's other titles besides that, but that was sort of the beacon, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. But, I mean, you had horror games that were very different to the usual survival type horror games coming out from indie studios. They were more narratively driven. I suppose if you're talking about survival horror games in the indie sense, then what was it? What's it, me boy? What was that other one? The one with the baby in the cellar. Is top-down indie.
Binding of Isaac.
Yeah, the Binding of Isaac is technically a survival horror game.
Yeah, I mean, it's like Super Smash TV, but yeah.
You know?
Survivally and horror-y.
Yeah, it is survivally and horror-y. But I think it's horror rather than survival horror. I'd say that in the indie genre has had a hand in saving. Sorry, the indie
I wouldn't say saving, yes, because it seems like the only company in a big scale that even remotely comes close to believing in it is Capcom. But Capcom have released two of the best survival horror games probably ever. I mean, one definitely is. I'd say the Resident Evil 2 remake is possibly the greatest survival horror game ever made.
Yeah.
Top 3, anyway.
Yeah.
So Capcom definitely believe it. So I don't think it's saved just yet, but I believe it's very, very near. It just needs other companies to sort of pick on it. I mean, I know there's the Blair Witch game that's coming out through an Xbox studio. That's a start.
Yeah.
But it's nearly there. It just needs a studio to glom onto it.
Yeah, but what about games like Soma?
What about them?
Or Amnesia?
They're different though, aren't they, really?
You understand what I mean when I'm saying?
Well, I suppose Alien Isolation as well with Sega, but yeah, still.
You know, they weren't the typical... Alien Isolation was more of a AAA title than than Amnesia or Soma, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that's my point. Soma and Amnesia aren't really indie games per se, but they're a lot more indie than Alien Isolation.
It's like that Hellblade Senua's, whatever it was called.
Senua's Sacrifice.
That was survival horror as well. Yeah. At least it used the visual language of the survival horror.
Layers of Fear was very much a horror game.
Yeah, and you go to EGX, you go to any sort of conference which has a lot of indie developers, and you will find a ton of horror games.
Yeah, Layers of Fear was very much an indie horror game through and through. It was surprising because for a lot of these games you will find on Steam, sometimes on early access, sometimes not, but you'll probably find that there are a lot more horror and survival horror games on Steam that you might actually enjoy than you might think. It's bizarre when you think about it because you've got games like Detention. Was it Taiwan?
Yeah, it's a Taiwanese. I have that. I've yet to play it. It's supposed to be excellent.
Yeah, but Detention it's kind of a survival horror, I suppose.
No, it's definitely a survival horror, but it's using the history of Taiwan, but displacing it through monsters and the grotesque.
Yeah.
But I think the big sort of, for me, the confirmation that horror games are back would be the legit return of Silent Hill. Like a new Silent Hill game. If that happened, I think survival horror is back where it needs to be.
Yeah.
But it's like, I say 2/3 of the way through a revival. I'm not quite there yet, but indie games are pretty much solely responsible for making them even remotely viable again.
Yeah. I do want to specify one thing. We are making a very big distinction between survival and survival horror.
I'm just sort of... You definitely are, but I'm just sort of lumping them all together.
Well, no, because survival and survival horror are two very different things. If you've got an open world survival game, that just means survive. It means learn how to catch fish, kill some animals, build a hut, make a fire, and protect yourself from the environment.
So things like The Long Dark and Don't Starve.
Basically, yeah.
Which is kind of horror, anyway.
Yeah, the horrific part. The horrific part comes from fear of the unknown. What was it? There's that new one coming out, Green Hell, is it? Where you're trapped in, say, the Amazon jungle, and so there's tribes around, there's snakes and mosquitoes and insects and crocodiles and jaguars and everything like that. And so you have to forage for food, you have to make weapons, you have to build a shelter and stuff like that. You have to protect yourself from the environment. The reason why you feel it's horrific is because of the tension from being in an unknown environment.
Okay, so that's enough of that. Let's move on to another genre which indie games save. What's your pick?
Well, indie games have definitely saved subgenres of RPGs, right?
That's pretty vague.
Well, subgenres of RPGs, when you look at your typical RPG, you've got certain distinct types. You've got the Japanese type RPG, the JRPG, which a lot of them are still turn-based and everything like that, but then you've got the crossovers with kind of the bridges between East and West, the Final Fantasy games and stuff like that.
For me, I think JRPGs died.
JRPGs haven't died.
No, they died in the sense of the big ones all have become this sort of action thing.
I don't know what planet you're living on.
Well, like the old style RPG where it's turn-based and it's very strategy-based, but now it's basically like Final Fantasy 15, a lot of them.
Again, I don't know what planet you're living on.
I have played them, Rob. Don't condescend to me on bloody recording.
I am going to condescend because you haven't played The Legend of Heroes, Trails of Cold Steel, or Trails in the Sky, which is just as big as Final Fantasy, if not bigger. It tells one continuous story arc throughout all of the games in the Legend of Heroes franchise, and is turn-based and a very, very proper dyed-in-the-wool JRPG. Complete with anime characters.
What he's did there, listeners and viewers, he's basically slapped his RPG sausage on the butcher's table.
Yes, I have. I've slapped all of it on the butcher's table. Anyway, leaving that to one side, because you do have that. The Square Enix games, they're basically designed to appeal to as much of an audience as possible. Whereas the Falcom games and your Atlas games and games like that, Persona is very much a JRPG.
Oh yeah, in a traditional sense.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So those games are very much targeted at fans of those types of games. Whereas Square Enix games, the Final Fantasy games, they're aimed at as many people as possible, whether Eastern or Western, doesn't matter. And then
they're not really aimed at RPG fans anymore, are they?
Yeah. Then you've got your Western RPGs, so stuff like The Witcher, stuff like what was it, Bound by Flame, and those sorts of games where Dragons, less Dragon's Dogma, Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen to a degree as well, but those sorts of games where it's very much the type of RPG that we know in the West as an RPG. The stuff that's based on D&D and stuff like that, or
Diablo, Baldur's Gate, stuff like that.
Yeah, the kind of isometric RPGs or the third-person perspective RPGs where you're in an open world going around with a big sword hitting things in the face. So, there are subgenres of those RPGs. Roguelikes, tactical RPG, first-person perspective, right? And by that I mean stuff like the old-school Eye of the Beholder. Now, indie games have very much kept those subgenres of RPGs alive, and I, for one, am very thankful to indie games for certain types of game that they've brought out. I'm a big fan of Moonlighter. That little indie game?
I never played it, but yeah.
It's basically a roguelike, procedurally generated dungeon crawler where you run a little shop in a small village and you have to try and revive the village by exploring the dungeon. You can't die in it. Top game, right? Loads of fun. I had lots of fun playing the game. But I've been playing this new game, which is developed by Dead Mage and published by 11-Bit Studios. I've got a review for it out, so have a watch of that because I'll go into more detail. It's called Children of Mortar, and it's basically what happens if you take the formula from Moonlighter and you build on it, and you build a story, a family, an actual quest. You build a world on this entire basis of procedurally generated roguelike dungeons, and you can't die. You just progressively get stronger and stronger and stronger, but the challenges you face also become more and more difficult. And I absolutely adore Children of Mortar because it drip feeds the story to you in ways, and that's one of the things I think indie devs do so well, is relaying the story, the narrative to the player in a way that is, in a way that the player doesn't feel like they're having to force the storyline. They're not having to, and the great thing about indie developed subgenres of RPG is that there is very little in the way of filler. There's very little in the way of side quests and stuff like that. Generally, this is what you have to do. Crack on with it.
I mean, look at Undertale. That'd never happen. Exactly. That should never have happened, but it did, and it was massive.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got, you've got loads of indie games that have become huge successes, just because they've taken this whole idea of the RPG and just done it in its simplest form.
Yeah, it kind of became like open world games having the big RPGs. Yeah. They're trying to appeal to as many people as possible.
Yeah. Tactical RPGs, Fellseal Arbiter's Mark is one of the latest tactical RPGs I've played on the PC. Again, got a review of it, so have a watch of that.
Are you just hyping things that you've reviewed?
No.
Yeah, I'm onto you.
Look, all I'm saying is that if I had to compare Fellseal with something like Final Fantasy Tactics or Tactics Ogre or something like that, another tactical RPG made by published by a big name publisher, right? Fellseal actually holds up, okay, and I'm talking about in terms of the narrative, in terms of the actual combat mechanics, in terms of the structure of the game itself. It actually holds up against stuff that's that came out from the big boys. So there are ways that the indie devs in the RPG subgenre can actually fight and hold the ground against the big developers and the big publishers, and that's something that I absolutely love.
Is there any other sort of smaller genres you want to draw attention to?
Well, I mean,
because there is for me. I mean, shoot 'em ups, shmups.
Yeah.
Which is the spaceship-based ones, are the ones where you are a character going from the left of the screen to the right of the screen.
Yeah. But
one is good. The shoot 'em ups of ships is being good, I think.
Yeah.
But the one where a character goes from left and the right has become basically like the indie open world. Yeah. It's become so prominent.
Yeah.
That they're all basically the same thing. Exactly. I mean, I know that one from Devolver looks good. My Friend Pedro looks great, but generally speaking. I do love, what was it called? Guns, Gore and Cannoli. Yeah, I love them too, but generally speaking, it's a genre which is much too bloated, but by being bloated, it has been saved.
Yeah. For me, I like that. But for me, I think one of the genres that was basically kept alive because it would have been a dead genre. I mean, quite literally a dead genre if it wasn't for indie games, is point-and-click adventures.
Oh, yeah. Big studios have long since lost faith in them.
Yeah. But point-and-click adventures, the only reason that they managed to survive is because of indie devs, and indie devs who basically put out point-and-click adventure games. I love you.
I think generally it was PlayStation 1, was their big thing. PlayStation 2, they just vanished, didn't they?
Yeah, they just died a death. The irony is, it's when open worlds started becoming the big thing, is when point-and-click adventures basically all but died.
Because you could debate that Telltale did save them, but I don't think that's the same thing.
Telltale didn't save them. Telltale just said, "Look, we're still here, right? We're still alive." You
compare Telltale to any of the classics, and I don't think Telltale stands a chance in hell of really standing up against them.
Well, the first season of The Walking Dead is still one of the best, but
that is a game which is overshadowed by its ending twist.
Yeah, exactly. But it was still a very well structured game.
Yeah, I guess.
But yeah, see, I know people will say stuff like real-time strategy games and stuff like that, but they never really went out of fashion. It's just they were
never in fashion. They just had their little corner, which is very popular.
That's what I was about to say. Quite literally, you took the words right out of my mouth. They never really went out of fashion because they were never in fashion. They're just in a niche over there.
Yeah, there's specialist clubs over in the corner there.
Yeah, but in interesting genre of games that was repopularized by indie games, especially mobile, was tower defense.
Yeah.
It's basically an RTS, but it's kind of a RTS light, isn't it?
Yes, basically.
So yeah, but yeah, there are several subgenres and subgenres and variations on genres that have been saved by indie developers.
Dungeon crawlers is another RPG subgenre.
Yeah, dungeon crawler. Like I said, that's why I generalized it and said subgenres of RPGs, because a lot of them have been saved. But let me put it this way: if it wasn't for indie games, right, then just about every single RPG that wasn't a JRPG would basically be a clone of The Witcher.
I wouldn't say Witcher, I'd say Skyrim.
Oh yeah, Skyrim. Sorry, yeah, you are exactly right. Basically a clone.
Witcher was the exception to the rule. Witcher was basically said, why are you all doing that? We're over here, we're much better.
Yeah, Skyrim, you are absolutely bang on correct. Right, but that's my point. If it wasn't for indie devs, that's what would have happened.
Yeah, which was a horrifying thought.
Yeah, and also a great point to end the episode.
Yes, it is. If you like that, comment below with your opinions and your thoughts and your suggestions for genres that could have been saved or have been saved. But don't forget to click that subscribe and that notification bell. And until next time here on Press X, thanks for watching.